All right, thank you so much for coming to our session. Our session is called Bringing the Workplace into Collection Development. I'm Allison Baller. I'm a business librarian at Texas A&M University.
And I'm Stacey Gilbert. I am a social sciences librarian and subject specialist to the advertising and PR department, media studies and journalism department at the University of Colorado Boulder.
And this is a presentation based off of a research project that we did surrounding workplace information resources in the advertising industry. Our objectives for this session are going to tell you about the benefits of analyzing the workplace when you are looking at collection development. We're also going to explain our methodology, how we did our research project. It's our intention that this would be something that could be used for other professional degrees such as engineering or medicine. And then we're also going to look at what the implications these analyses have for libraries, that maybe some more traditional methods of collection development don't lead to some of these different implications and things to think about. And then finally at the end we'll open it up for questions, and we're going to invite you to think about some of the more, your students' workplaces and the information resources that they're encountering there. So to start with, we wanted to kind of think about our traditional methods of collection development assessment and how we normally go about deciding what we're going to buy for our students. So mostly the traditional methods center around being collection-centered or user-centered. So when we talk about collection-centered, we think about using the collection itself to determine your collection resources and your decisions. So using methods in this avenue stem from things like citation analysis. So looking at papers and looking at what those papers are citing to determine what's of value that your students and faculty are citing. Or using journal lists and trying to determine rankings, and if one journal is more valuable than the other, how does that play into your collection development activities. Other things that can happen when you're doing collection-centered development is looking at lists of standards. So if there are certain prescribed standards or core collections that are ones that should be in a particular collection for a discipline, those are sometimes used to determine as a baseline of what your collection should be centered around. And then also analyzing syllabi. There are a lot of studies that analyze syllabi that students are using to see what what journals they're trying to incorporate into the discipline, what books they're reading, to give us an idea of what we should be providing the library so that they can do their studies. On the user-centered side of things, this is anything that has to do with looking at the user population and how they influence collection development. So studies in the user-centered avenue include anything to do with usage statistics, how often things are used, either electronically, or circulation statistics, how often something physically circulates. Sometimes people have also used Google Analytics to determine statistics that way and really get down and analyze how users are using different types of resources. So both of these methods are very valid methods of collection development. We wanted to see if there was another way that we could come at collection development that would be a little bit different. And we were thinking about a student's workplace. And the reason that we thought of a student's workplace is because when we think of higher education, oftentimes the underlying aim of higher education is to prepare a student to take on a role in a workplace. We're prepping them, we're building them, we're giving them the skills that they need to go out and work in their chosen profession in the workplace. So it made sense to us to look at that workplace and see what information resources that they're using in the workplace that we could maybe prepare them for and get them using in the academic setting that they could later go on to use in the workplace and be set up to take on those resources and not be encountering those for the first time when they're on the job. We also thought that this really did increase the value of the library collection. We all know that our library has lots of valuable resources for our students and faculty, but when I tell students about a resource and I tell them that it could be helpful for their future career, they're much more apt to want to learn how to use it and want to learn how to use it well. If they see a utility for it beyond just doing a paper or doing a research report, if they know that it's going to be helpful in their internship, in their job, they might bump up into it across another workplace someday, that makes them more invested in wanting to use the resource more. Also for library stakeholders, when you can highlight the fact that you have library resources that students are going to use in the workplace, this can help people from the outside look at the library and have an increased sense of value to the resources that we already have. It gives them a little bit different way to look at the resources that we have, that not only are they being able to be utilized in academia, but they're also being able to be utilized in the workforce as well.
Okay, so what we did was we picked a discipline to study and see what resources they're using in the workplace. So our goal of our study was to look at the advertising industry and identify resources used in that industry. And then secondary objective was to compare the resources we found in the industry and see which of these databases academic libraries are providing for students. Just a note, when we talk about advertising in higher education, advertising is a part of marketing, which is a part of business, but in higher education, advertising was once part of business in like the early 1900s. By like 1950s, business decided advertising was too practical and dropped it, so journalism picked it up. And often you'll find advertising programs in journalism and communication schools. So advertising as an industry is part of business, but in higher education, just know it is not business, not technically business. And something else to mention, although we're looking at the advertising industry as a case study and presenting the results here, we hopefully think that other practical programs can use some of the methods we did. So what we did a content analysis of 407 early career advertising positions, descriptions at 49 advertising agencies. We used Advertising Redbooks, it's a database with advertising agencies, to develop a list of agencies. And then we went to each of those agencies and to see, do they make their job descriptions public? And that's how we gathered the position descriptions. If you replicate this in other disciplines, like I know engineering kind of has like their own database, so it's kind of discipline specific where you go to look for those positions. So when selecting the positions, we use purposive sampling based on this criteria. So it had to be positions in the United States, full-time rather than part-time or contract positions, have less than 4 years of experience to capture early career advertising positions. They had to be advertising related, so if they were in HR, finance, that wasn't exactly what we're looking for. They had to mention at least one information resource, since that was kind of the purpose of this study. It was also possibly a flaw in that it had one information resource that it really captured certain jobs over others. So I think that kind of skewed some of the results in the end. For example, a lot of the creative positions, so people who actually design and create an advertisement, tend to not even mention one information resource. So that kind of skewed some of our results.
That's a good question.
Yeah.
For information resource, like I know what that means for me. It's like,
yeah.
Like would you include like a Adobe Creative Suites or like industry tools that we often license but don't necessarily teach, or like
Yes.
at an IL capacity?
We often look at how the language they use around a resource. So if they said use the Adobe Analytics to gather data, then that's an information resource. They said use Adobe Creative Suites to, I don't know, find information, which I don't think that came up. But so we didn't look at like what applications they're always using to view information. So like Excel didn't count, for example.
Or if they just listed Adobe as a skill,
Yeah.
like just a list, that didn't count. We really wanted to focus on if they were asking them to utilize them in a certain
Like
way.
as a okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
And usually it's pretty clear.
Yeah.
Which kind of example here. so like experience with like analytics platforms or knowledge of certain technologies, and they usually list it out like in groups. So that actually kind of helped us see or like track what we're looking for. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay. So yeah, this slide shows an example of a position description, and mainly what we're getting at is we use a database, or we use a software called Atlas TI, which is a content analysis software, kind of like in Vivo. Since we had so many positions, we wanted a software to help keep track. Since we also divided up the work of coding, Atlas allowed for syncing up projects. So we use Atlas TI to actually perform the content analysis. We put all the positions into Atlas TI, and then we went through and created a code book so we knew what to look for and what to code for. That actually took quite a lot of time, especially, I think Allison mentioned or talk a little more about this later, is a lot of these platforms and technologies change names over time. So a code book, new names and new things to look for, as well as some of the older names, positions we're still using is helpful for looking for certain things. So we coded mainly through things, what type of job it is, and so like what job categories, like account manager, are they in media planning. We looked at how many years of experience the job required, and then we individually coded each information resource as it appeared.
After we had done that, we entered sort of phase 2, if you will, of our study, where we looked at the library side of things. So we looked at the workplace resources, and then we wanted to compare that to what university libraries had that may relate to advertising. So what we did was compile a list of advertising programs of universities that had advertising programs. And we ended up with 158 of these. To create this list, there's an online brochure, I guess you could say, that's called Where Shall I Go to Study Advertising? It used to be a print resource and it's since changed to an online resource. It's a pretty comprehensive resource of all the advertising programs in the US. And there's also been research done on advertising programs. So we used the list from the paper, that research, and then the list from the online brochure, and we sort of meshed those two together. And then we went through and found which universities had actual advertising degree programs. It didn't make the list if it just had an advertising class or just a few classes in advertising. That wasn't enough for us, for our study, to say that they had an advertising program. Also, if something had more of a public relations focus, we didn't include that either because that's oftentimes more of a communications type of area, and that really wasn't what we were focused on. So after we compiled this list of 158 universities, we used every library's AZ database tool to go through and cross-match any resources that we found with the advertising resources. So you can imagine we had quite a few advertising resources, but not as many library resources. And we also included in this comparison databases that contain trade journals. Oftentimes in the advertising positions, they would say things like, want applicant to have industry-specific news or be able to find industry news by reading trade publications. In the library, this is most often seen in our database aggregators that might have the types of journals, Ad Week or Ad Age, that will describe what's going on in the advertising industry and have that sort of industry niche information that they want their applicants. So that's why we included databases as well that might include those potential trade journals. So what did we find? Stacy's going to talk about what we found on the job advertising side.
Okay, so the 400 job postings, we found 186 resources mentioned. Of the 186, only 23 resources appeared in 5% or more positions. So nearly 200 resources, but only 20-ish of them are being repeated in multiple positions. This table here just shows kind of like the top 10 most mentioned databases. You can see like ComScore is #1 for sure, with 120 positions requiring that ComScore, followed by Google Analytics. And Google also owns DoubleClick and GfK MRI, which has consumer information, and Nielsen, which basically controls our TV ratings and a lot of market research. What else did I say? One caveat or something that made this coding process difficult was sometimes positions would mention a company, and other times it will actually mention like the product or like the actual service people need to use. So ComScore is an example of a company. But ComScore's most popular product is called Media Metrics, and that has website analytics and audience use of websites. So other positions would also just mention Media Metrics. So we had to kind of say unspecified ComScore products and unspecified Nielsen products. But later on in the resource list, there's really specific products within there.
To make better sense out of these 186 resources, we developed different categories. We really found that there was a really wide breadth and range of resources that these different agencies were using. And to get a better handle on what these different types of information resources were doing and what their function was, we created these categories. So things like programmatic advertising, search engine marketing, and reach frequency and audience measurement were all categories that we created to make better sense of these trends. And what we kind of saw from this was that some of the more data-intensive resources, so programmatic advertising is resources that are used to place ads on websites, search engine marketing, using specific keywords to try and get different results and kind of retool where your company is going to show up in a results list. And different things like audience measurement, which Stacey mentioned before. Nielsen has a lot of products in that. These are all types of tools that require a very specific set of skills. Things like looking up consumer research or looking up news articles aren't as data intensive, so they're fairly easy things to go about once you have the correct tools. So we sort of thought that maybe job ads weren't really calling out specific news article resources or even consumer research resources because they didn't look at those as skills that people really wanted to have, or they just looked at them as, if we have these tools, they'll be really easy for people to use. If they were calling specific information resources out in their job ads, and they were more likely to fall into one of the top categories, they really wanted applicants who had those specific skill sets, and that was important enough to them to call out that very specific information resource. So after we looked at all the resources and the content analysis of the job advertisements, we looked at the library side of things. And this is sort of our top 10 list of the resources that we found in the library. So out of those 186 resources that we found in the job advertisements, only 11 of those were ones that we could find that libraries actually subscribe to. And there are a couple reasons for this. We'll get into this in a couple slides. An additional 8 were databases that contain those trade journals with that industry information I was talking about. It is kind of interesting, though, that ComScore, the one that was mentioned the most in job advertisements, only 1% of the libraries actually subscribe to that. And then some of the more heavily used resources like Mintel or SRDS weren't mentioned as much in the advertising resources. So that tells us that we're maybe subscribing to some things that maybe aren't used as much in the advertising industry. And that some things like Simmons OneView or University Reporter that fell in the middle maybe should get a second glance if there's an advertising program that needs to be supported and they're being used very frequently, or they say they're being used frequently in the job advertisements. So what does this all mean? So we have a fair amount of data. I'm trying to kind of sift through this and what it means for us as librarians and what we can maybe do about it to provide a better experience for our students so they're more prepared for the workplace with these resources. There are a couple challenges with this though, especially when you're dealing with industry resources. And we talk a lot about this as business librarians, the sort of academic versus industry dichotomy. As Stacey alluded to before, in industry you have these really rapidly revolving resources and they change constantly. And I think this is so different than academic products where if an academic product is going to even come out with a new interface, there's at least a 6-month rollout where they're sending emails, they're wanting user studies, they have focus groups of librarians, they really want to make sure that they're rolling something out that librarians aren't going to be surprised. The industry doesn't care so much about that, right? Their main point is to acquire different companies and make money and provide content for their commercial clients. So Nielsen is a big one. I put Arbitron up there just as an example, but Nielsen acquires new products and businesses almost every other month, it seems like. So that's just one example of how things like that really change pretty rapidly. Radian 6 is a social listening tool. It's used to peg what's going on in Twitter or Facebook so you can keep track of what your company's activity is, what people are saying about it. That got bought out by Salesforce and it got rolled up into sort of their platform. So it doesn't even exist in the same context that it did as it was Radian 6. And then this one's particularly fun because in the course of writing this paper, a resource changed on us. So all of our data is interesting because as of June 2018, Google had owned DoubleClick, but now they're completely doing away with DoubleClick and they're rolling that all into their own platform. So it's not even going to look the same. So those are just 3 examples, but we had countless examples in our code book of this was referred to as this, but this was an older name. So when job positions refer to this, they really mean this. And this has just never happened in the academic world. So even if an academic librarian were to try to even consider subscribing or getting some sort of license to these, you would have to contend with this continually revolving, changing of the hands of the guards, and try to contend with what this means for your licensing, and what this means for your users. If things are changing too much, students aren't really going to use it. They don't like that. They're just trying to learn something. They don't want something that's going to be changed or rolled up into something else.
Okay, so I think there are a number of challenges librarians face when we're trying to work with some professional resources. And this bullet point, or these bullet points, are based on a lot of our personal experience and not so much of what we found in the data. But I think we just in general find industry resources are just ill-equipped to serve the academic market, mostly because the academic market are secondary clients. They do not support accessibility requirements that we just have to have, and our students have to have. They sometimes don't offer IP authentication and require individual accounts, which can make it really hard for librarians to manage users and provide access to users. And they often don't have an academic pricing model. So they also don't, and their pricing model usually requires individual accounts based on the number of accounts they have, which doesn't quite work for the academic setting. We've also found it to be difficult to sometimes communicate with vendors because we are their secondary clients. Getting a hold of them is sometimes a challenge, and also communicating with them of what do students need and what is the purpose, the educational purpose that they're getting out of a database. It's sometimes hard to communicate when the only contact some of these vendors have worked with universities is to sell their marketing products to campus marketing. So they think we're trying to use it for marketing purposes when it's really an educational purpose.
So what can we do about this? Is there really a solution? And I use solution, that's a little bit of maybe a misnomer. I don't want to get anyone excited because I'm not sure there really is a solution. Some things to think about though are thinking about those academic versions of corporate products. Sometimes academic versions exist. They're not the corporate product as you would encounter it in industry, but things like Simmons OneView do exist for the academic world. It's just the data is slightly different. So if you buy Simmons OneView in an academic universe, the data is embargoed for 2 years. You're not getting the most recent up-to-date data. But at least that can get students thinking about the data itself, getting them familiar with where it comes from, getting them familiar with what is Simmons OneView, how do I cross-tabulate things. I know MRI has a university reporter, so they have an academic branded part instead of their corporate product. So there are some things that you can think about there. If there's an academic version, it might not be different, and you might have to be very cognizant of the differences between the academic product and the industry product. But it's something that you can definitely use to at least get your students introduced to that particular resource. I think it's also important too, we always talk about transferable skills and information literacy, but it's not always all about the tools either. If you can teach your students how to research consumers, research the market, and not make them dependent on one particular tool, they should be able to take that kind of thinking and that kind of research mode onto another tool. So whether they're encountering it in the academic world or they encounter it in the industry world and they're asked to look at the target market, at least they know the kind of information that they're after, and they might be able to put it together a little bit more easily if we kind of focus on helping them with that search process instead of pushing so much the tools. Another thing to think about is being knowledgeable about the different types of data that are involved. So for the advertising industry, a big part of what they were asking the applicants to know was SRDS data. And although they weren't asking for that particular tool, we know that SRDS data exists in many of the industry resources, such as Nielsen. So a lot of the libraries did subscribe to SRDS as a separate product, but being able to teach students about SRDS, about what it means, what it's used for, when they encounter that type of data, even if it's within a platform or a larger space, they can be able to know where that information is coming from and be able to have a better idea of where that fits into their research and what they're trying to do. Another thing that is not always successful, but sometimes it works, is exploring cost sharing. If there's a niche resource that maybe the library doesn't want to pay for because it's just for one department or it's very specific to one program, sometimes you can get the department to chip in a little bit of money. If it's that important for their students to learn and it's that important for their studies, they might be more receptive to cost sharing if they see that it's something that's really going to be utilized and helpful to students. And then finally, along with that, leveraging resources across campus. Stacy had mentioned, or Stacy has an example of she was trying to get a particular resource and she didn't realize that the marketing department on her campus actually had already worked with this resource. And so she figured it out and she was able to leverage her campus connections and they were able to get her somebody to talk to in that industry's office and be able to, they had an existing contract that they were able to build off of. So not using their resource, but just being able to recognize that sometimes those ties exist. Someone was already subscribing to and using that particular vendor's product. So they were able to have at least start a dialogue and know the person to go to and be able to have a receptive person on the other end to work with them and kind of talk about things like contracts and different things like that. So I'll always be thinking about too if it's marketing resource or if it's some resource that somebody else might actually be using on campus to do their job, that could be a relationship that you could utilize and at least get contacts and people to talk to that way. So I think we have about 10 more minutes. I think we're running mostly on time. We're opening up the floor for questions, or if you want to have any comments, if you can think of any databases that you've dealt with that are very specific to a professional degree program. If you found that these products are very different for licensing or have different considerations and challenges, we'd love to hear about those as well. Yes.
Oh, just one thing to add to the previous slide is,
yeah.
Maybe this is like totally obvious, but like I don't collect for the job prospects of my students. I'm sure they would like me to. I collect for it to support the research and curricular needs of my campus. And so I think a big piece of this would be engaging with faculty about like how they're, you know, what kind of data, like are they aware of the industry products? I'm sure in a lot of cases they are more intimately aware than me. And like, is there a way that we can integrate the use of those data sets or data products into their teaching?
Mm-hmm.
And we are happy to license that if it's affordable, or just get like a single set of logins for a classroom setting, or work with the vendor, kind of use our licensing and vendor knowledge to broker that. Because if it's not in the curriculum, I'm not gonna buy it probably.
Mm-hmm.
It's just outside of my mandate, so I would just add that to that list.
I have a question, and then I have a vendor thing. My question is, when you were collecting this data and looking at what products the libraries had, like for example, you mentioned, you know, like the Simmons data and also the MRI data. For us, those are available in a multitude of platforms.
Mm-hmm.
Did you count it if a library had one of those other platforms, or were you just looking at the platform used on the corporate side?
I guess, well, yeah.
We were just trying to make it easy on ourselves. So sometimes the libraries didn't really specify what exactly platform they were using. So if they said Simmons OneView, we just counted it as Simmons.
We didn't like look at like Statista, might have some GFK MRI stuff, like we didn't count Statista.
But would you have counted like MediaMark?
I think we did. I think that's what MRI is.
Yeah.
MRI
But then
is reported.
would you have counted Simply Analytics, which has both Simmons and MRI in it?
No, because that.
It's
I
kind of
don't
like
think
a
that
different
platform's
iteration of the product. Yeah, so we didn't count that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So that was one question. And
I
then,
guess, sorry, if I can jump in.
oh no.
Sorry, I also used to work in advertising, by the way, so I think that's different context to bring here. But also, the main thing I think with Simmons data, when they mention Simmons in job positions, they're looking for a crosstab.
Right.
And
Yeah.
that's
To
not
use that.
something
That's
like-
why I was part of why I
And
was
that's
wondering.
not
that,
something
yeah.
like Simply Analytics offers
Correct.
at this time. Although I heard they're working on
They're
it.
getting better.
Yeah. So that's why like Simply, Analytics didn't
Okay.
come up
Cool.
for us. Yeah. And so what's your other thing?
No, I just wanted to talk about Nielsen data because I licensed that within the past year for some faculty, which was a big pile of money. And it's a big pile of money for very few people because they have to approve all of the projects for it. So if it were something that I wanted to use for my students to get a handle on how to use that data for future job use, I couldn't do that. They have to approve every single faculty project, right? And they won't approve like classroom use of it. So, I mean, just a comment again about the difference between the corporate and academic sides of these.
That's
Yeah.
good.
Yes, that's a good word for it.
Is that a hand?
Yes. So you mentioned that you saw both company mentions and then specific product mentions. In your final coding, how did you end up resolving that issue of non-specificity?
We kept it separate, but we just always said unspecified ComScore products or like unspecified Nielsen products to make that distinction. Because there really was no way of looking at the postings and seeing, are they talking about media metrics here, or are they talking about different ComScore products?
We realize that's a limitation of the study too, is that we could only gather the data off of the job advertisement. You know, we couldn't ask further questions of the job, so we were limited to what we could see in the context that it was written in.
But that's a great follow-up study if anyone wants to do
Yes.
interviews with some people. Okay.
So we have bought some industry-specific tools for hospitality and for the real estate programs that we have. And we've run into many of the same problems that you mentioned in there. We generally have a lot of support from the schools, so we have been able to do some cost sharing. We've even had a couple of cases where there were alumni involved in those companies, and they were able to work with them to have some level of donation to go along with it. But you definitely do run into all of those things that you were talking about. But they are used very, not just by students, but also by faculty doing in research, especially in the real estate program. The data that they have is very valuable for their research. But it is, to a certain extent, pulling teeth to get, because they don't work with academia much at all, and their systems and their pricing, it takes a lot of negotiation in order to try and fit what you're in. And we're not in I think it would be even worse if we were in an urban campus where other people could come in and use these resources potentially. That's not the case where we are, so there's not much risk of that. But the last thing these companies want is giving free access to other companies about who walk in. So.
Any other questions?
How did you guys come up with this methodology? Is it something that you just, like, is it pre-existing, or did you just chat about it and try to?
A little bit. I think there's a first paper in a marketing journal looking at marketing skills among marketers. And then I wrote a paper before this one looking at information literacy skills and job positions. So I followed that marketing paper and their methodology. And then this paper and this study kind of came out of that, of looking at specifically information resources. Yeah, so it's a few iterations of it.
It's really cool.
Yeah, it would be cool
It's
to
very
spin it out into other
Yeah.
fields for sure.
Right.
100%, very interesting.
It's super time intensive though.
Yeah.
Just collecting the positions took 6 months, at least the way we did it. I think the marketing journal I mentioned, they looked at monster.com and they were able to pull like every fifth posting going back a few months, and they were able to get hundreds of jobs that way. So depending on what your method is.
Oh, you mean
can
like
make it a lot
literally,
easier.
literally finding the collection of job postings was
Yeah.
intensive? I see.
Right, yeah.
Okay. Not even the coding and the like analysis
Yeah.
piece.
Yeah.
Okay.
But there's probably ways to make it like easier for yourself. Yeah.
Have you thought about doing this for accounting?
You should do it for accounting.
You guys know how to do it.
I'm not very familiar with the accounting industry, so I would not be a very good expert on their specific tools and what they were using. Why do you say accounting in particular? Are there particular challenges involved?
As some of you probably know better than I do, I do accounting, but I don't know much about it. There's a limited number of major players who've all been brought out by bigger publishers in the last 10 years. CCH, for example, change its name. RIA and BNA and a few others. Which ones are most important to have and they all compete with each other, and they all do a tax and accounting and other things. So you could probably just get one of those and get all the data in your set, or have bits and pieces of content from different ones and provide the same content across 3 subscriptions. What's the best set of packages to have to serve your CPA students, for example?
I was looking at, one of our data analysts who works in like the data resource center, she's like a student facing data expert. We were looking at DataStream versus Bloomberg, just trying to understand that, like at my office, like at my computer for like 30 seconds, not this level of depth. But I was like, I don't know what they use in the industry, like I don't know what they use in the real world. What's the industry standard for those financial data products? And she was like, go look it up on Monster. So we did, and there are specific data products that are called out by brand in like the financial analysts and that kind of sector. It's not as clear cut, like it's not like as clear cut as a CPA, where that's like a very defined job. It's a mushier set of jobs, but I'd be curious to kind of use a lighter version of this method to see what is being used in the industry around financial data sets, because we spend a lot of money on that stuff. We got a litany of products, and they all have like an industry presence. So
You might also look into like accounting trade journals and see if they publish like the top industry companies, because that's where we found some, for like our lit review, that's kind of where we found some, the closest thing we could find to anything about what our advertisers using. That's the trade journals and like the top databases by revenue is where we found some information there. So if you want like the light version.
Where are you publishing this?
The Behavioral and Social Sciences Librarian.
Soon, hopefully.
Cool,
by
it's
the
coming
end
out
of this year.
soon.
Awesome.
Yeah.
I'm excited to read it.
yeah.
Well, I just had a thought when you guys were talking about this, because it was this really interesting study and methodology and everything, but I'm thinking, I'm wondering if your career services people on your campus would be a good way for finding out what your recruiters are looking for, specifically what kind of skills they are, because then they and your faculty can talk about what kinds of things, so which resources, should it be a BNA product, should it be the CCH and teleconnect or whatever those people are looking for, because you've got the big universe up there, but especially if you're in a regional school where your students tend to be going to in geographically constrained areas, then that's maybe what you would want to.
Yeah.
I think that's a
Make
great
that
way to
alignment.
leverage connections
So-
and really show them what more you have to give and offer to their program.
Yeah, that's a great idea.
I'll step in because I work with Allison, and we are actually trying to get connections with our career center and kind of build on that, and that's one of our goals, is to kind of figure out what they're looking for and what they're advertising, so that is something.
They will love you.
And there's one other thing I'll just mention, because at my school, I think the institution was looking at this Burning Glass database. It's some labor-related database. It wasn't for the library, it was for purposes of the administration, campus administration, looking at the new academic program array and looking at new programs to develop and the competitive analysis. And one of the things it does is it ingests job descriptions, the real job descriptions. So I'm just thinking that if
Right.
campuses had access to that,
Just do some text mining from that,
right,
yeah.
you could get from there rather than having to go out
So
to
where
some
was
third party, because it
that?
seems to me that you
Right.
could probably get output from there more easily than from a web-based.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't know much about the product because I don't think we ever subscribed if the campus did.
Interesting. Did you have something else, Lisa?
Yeah, I was gonna say that we did something, not really content similar. And what we found was, coding is incredibly time consuming, but text mining is much faster and is accurate. So if you do continue, I'd be happy to chat with you about some of the text mining services that we used, because they were truly, it took us 5 minutes to do the text mining and like a whole month of 4 of us to do the actual coding. So it makes a huge difference in terms of time.
Thanks.
And I think that we're at time, by the way, but
Yeah.
we're happy to continue talking if anyone's interested. Thank you for coming.
Don't like